times. Now that word fulfilled shows us why Luke wrote this account. For him, the story of Jesus isn't just ancient history. He wants to show how it's the fulfillment of the long covenant story of God in Israel, bigger than that, of the story of God in the whole world. The book's design is fairly clear. There's a long introduction that sets up the stories of John the Baptist and Jesus. Then in chapters 3 to 9, Luke presents a robust portrait of Jesus and his mission in his home region of Galilee. After that, the large midsection of the book is Jesus' long journey to Jerusalem, which leads to the story's climax, Jesus' final week in Jerusalem leading up to his death and resurrection, which then leads on into the book of Acts. In this video, we're just going to focus on the first half of Luke's Gospel. The extended introduction tells in parallel the birth stories of John the Baptist and Jesus. So you have this elderly priestly couple, Zechariah and Elizabeth, and then this young unmarried woman, Mary and Joseph. They both receive an unlikely divine promise that they're going to have a son. Both promises are fulfilled then, as John and then Jesus are born, and both parents sing poems of celebration. Now these poetic songs, they're filled with echoes from the Old Testament psalms and prophets, showing how these children will fulfill God's ancient promises. But these poems also preview each child's role in the story to follow. So John is the prophetic messenger promised in the Torah and the prophets who's going to prepare Israel to meet their God. Jesus, he's the Messianic king promised to David, who's going to bring God's reign over Israel and God's blessing to the nations, just like he promised Abraham. After this, Mary brings Jesus to the Jerusalem temple for his dedication. And two elderly prophets, Anna and Simeon, they see Jesus and they recognize who he is. And Simeon sings his own song, a poem inspired by the prophet Isaiah. He says, "This child is God's salvation for Israel, and he will become a light to the nations." So with all this anticipation, the story moves forward into the next main section, where Luke presents Jesus and his mission. He sets the stage with John's renewal movement of the Jordan River, where he's calling a new, repentant, recommitted Israel into existence through baptism. He's preparing for the arrival of God's kingdom. And then Jesus appears as the leader of this new Israel, and he's marked out by the Spirit and the voice of God from heaven. He is the beloved Son of God. After this, Luke follows with the genealogy. It traces Jesus' origins back to David, then back to Abraham, and then all the way back to Adam from the book of Genesis. Luke's claiming here that Jesus is the Messianic King of Israel who will bring God's blessing, but not only to Israel, the family of Abraham. He is here for all the sons of Adam, for all of humanity. After this, Luke has strategically placed the story of Jesus going to his hometown Nazareth, where he launches his public mission. At a synagogue gathering, Jesus stands up and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to preach good news to the poor and freedom for the prisoners, new sight for the blind, and freedom for the oppressed." Now, along with the other Gospels, Jesus is presented here as the Messianic King, bringing the good news of God's kingdom. But what Luke uniquely highlights are the social implications of Jesus' mission. So he brings freedom. The Greek word is phasis. It literally means release. It refers to the ancient Jewish practice of the year of Jubilee, described in Leviticus 25. It's when all Israelite slaves were released, when people's debts were canceled, when land that was sold is returned back to families. It's all a symbolic reenactment of God's liberating justice. And then Jesus says that this good news of release is specifically for the poor. Now, in the Old Testament, the poor, or in Hebrew, ani, it's a much broader category than just people who don't have very much money. It refers also to people of low social status in their culture, like people with disabilities, or women, and children, and the elderly. It also can include social outsiders, like people of other ethnic groups, or people whose poor life choices have placed them outside acceptable religious circles. And Jesus says that God's kingdom is especially good news for these people. So after this, Luke immediately puts in front of us a large block of stories, showing us what Jesus' good news for the poor looks like. It involves the healing of a bedridden sick woman, or a man who has a skin disease, or someone who's paralyzed. There are stories here also about Jesus welcoming into his community a tax collector, like Levi, who's not financially poor, but he is a social outsider. There's a story about Jesus forgiving a prostitute. Luke's showing us how Jesus' kingdom brought restoration and reversal of people's whole life circumstances. He's expanding the circle of people who get invited in to discover the healing power of God's kingdom. And as Jesus' mission attracts a large following, he does something even more provocative. He forms these people into a new Israel by appointing over them the 12 disciples as leaders corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Jesus teaches his manifesto of an upside-down kingdom, or as Luke calls it, the sermon given on the plain. He says God's love for the outsider and the poor means that his kingdom brings a reversal of all of our value systems. He is here to form a new alternative people of God who are going to respond to Jesus' invitation by practicing radical generosity, by serving the poor. People who are going to lead by serving and live by peacemaking and forgiveness. People who are deeply pious but who reject religious hypocrisy. Now, Jesus' radical kingdom vision is claim to divine authority. It starts to generate resistance and controversy, especially from Israel's religious leaders. His outreach to questionable people is a threat to their religious traditions and their sense of social stability. And so they start accusing Jesus of blaspheming God and being a drunk and mixing with sinners. And so this section culminates in a new revelation of Jesus' mission to his disciples. He says that, yes, he is the Messianic king, and that he's going to assert his reign over Israel by dying in Jerusalem, by becoming the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who dies for the sins of Israel. And then this shocking idea, it gets explored in the next story, as Jesus goes up a mountain with 3 of his disciples, and he's suddenly transformed in front of them. They're enveloped in this cloud of God's presence, who announces, "This is my chosen son." And then Moses and Elijah are there, the 2 other prophets who encountered God's presence and voice on the mountain. And Luke tells us that they're talking together about Jesus' exodus that he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Now that Greek word exodus is a clear reference to the Exodus story. Luke is portraying Jesus here as a new Moses who will lead his newly formed Israel into freedom and release from the tyranny of sin and evil in all of its forms, personal, spiritual, and social. And that's going to lead us into the second half of the book. But for now, that's the first half of the Gospel according to Luke.
The New Testament. At the same time, siya yung longest. Longest siya among the Gospel. Ang writer na, sinabi kanina, si Luke. Si Luke, ang observation niya is a physical. Pag nagkalito ko, nawawala yung slide. Makikita natin sa Colossians 4:14, na doon sinabing, Luke, our dear friend Luke, the doctor. Siya yung doctor. So, at the same time, siya lang din yung only Gentile author in the New Testament. Hindi siya Hudyo. Soon, pag-aaralan natin yung Acts. Ito na sinabi dito. It's like yung book of Luke at book of Acts. Si Luke lang nag-write sa kanya. And sa introduction, in-address na dito kay Theophilus. Theophilus, sa Tagalog, sabi nga, Theophilo. Patoon, kakayong pangalan is Theophilo. Mas maganda yung Theophilo kasi ang meaning ng Theophilus is 1 plus 1. So si Luke, dahil gusto niya kay Theophilus ang katulungan. So being a doctor, napaka-importante na very good ka sa details, diba? Unless, kung ka sa doctor, alam yung details ng mangyayari. From diagnosis, from treatment. But then sa atin, pinakita ni Luke by writing yung kanyang mensahe na sinabi, Luke had to be careful writing this book to Theophilus para ma-convince niya yung katotohanan, especially the life of Jesus Christ. And in a sense, it also addressed to us as a Christian na kailangan alam din natin ano ba talaga ang katotohanan. Sa i-press mo lang na truth is very important ba? Para sa atin, it will also, knowing the truth will be a life and death. If we know Jesus Christ as the one who God sent na forgiveness sa atin, that will give us eternal life, then that's life. If we ignore, sabi nga, and then we go to be death. So, sa Tagalog, sinabing, press mo lang sa akin, press mo lang ng enter. Sa Tagalog, kung babasahin ko yung first verses, Yamang marami ang nagsikap bumuo ng isang maayos na salaysay tungkol sa mga naganap na ating kalagitnaan ayon sa nilalahad sa atin ng mga taong noong pamansimula ay may saksi at mga lingkod ng salita at matapos ang ating masusuling pagsisiyasat sa lahat tuwat isang simula. Minabuti kong sumulat din ng isang maayos na salaysay para sa inyo, kagalang-galang na ito, upang maunawaan mo ang katiyakan ng mga bagay na ito. Kumbaga, sa four Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, yung book of Luke lang yung may parang prilog na yung book of Luke lang yung merong introductions. Kasi yung book of Matthew nag-start sa genealogy, yung book of Acts, John nag-start siya na sinabing in the beginning, the Word of God. Ang Mark, nag-start siya sa in the beginning, John the Baptist. So, i-present natin dito na yung blueprint. Kung titignan natin, kung bubuksan natin yung Biblia natin, ang Luke is only divided into three, yung birth, preparation in Jesus Christ, yung message, and ministry in Jesus Christ, at yung death and resurrection in Jesus Christ. Ang mga negative na, nauna, si Jesus Christ our Savior. As a physician, napakahalaga, paano nyo na-explain? Kung siya'y doktor, tapos nakita natin yung account na ito may dalawang isang couple na matanda, tapos isang virgin na anak. Sa understanding ni Luke na sa doktor, parang ang hirap explain na. Pero pinakita niya yun, na Jesus Christ is a perfect leader and Savior. History, as a doctor, hindi siya mag-emphasize sa dates and details. So kung nakakita natin doon, in the time of King, in the 6 months, na mga ganong details. People, nandoon very interested si Jesus Christ sa lahat ng klase ng tao. And in the book of Luke, doon maraming kwento, maraming parables din about Him. Compassion ni Jesus Christ, nakita natin doon. And ang nakita din natin doon, yung Holy Spirit, yung banal na Espiritu na mula nung pinanganak si Jesus Christ, yung baptism niya, yung ministry, and in resurrection as a perfect example for us. Jesus gave independence and peace. So, pinakita na, at this time, yung oras medyo sagad, yung PowerPoint hindi umaandar again. Let us pray. Thank you, Lord God, that you are here once again in another short presence in our midst. We thank you that we can, by your power, by your Spirit, that we are able to magtuturo, magbibigay ng encouragement sa amin sa patuloy namin pagbabasa ng mga salita. Maunawaan ang hindi ko nyo lang sa amin. Maraming salamat. Maraming salamat ang Espiritu namin. Turo at gawang Pinoon sa amin. Thank you, Lord. Hindi na rin at this time again. Walang PowerPoint, salita na lang ng Pinoon. Thank you, God. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Please subscribe, click the bell notification, like, comment, and share.